Blood hit the emergency room floor before the alarms finished screaming. A dying special operations soldier was wheeled in with 3 bullets in his chest and a classified code on his lips. And within 60 seconds, the most powerful man in the hospital quietly ordered the staff to let him die. Nobody questioned it. Nobody except Megan Carter, an ER nurse the doctors had spent 3 years calling irrelevant, incompetent, and easy to ignore. She looked at the soldier. She looked at the director. Then she grabbed the crash cart herself. "I'm not letting him die." That decision was about to unravel everything. If this story has you hooked already, follow my channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The night Megan Carter's life changed started the same way most of her nights did, badly and without warning. She was 40 minutes into a double shift at Redwood Regional Medical Center when the overhead lights in Bay 4 flickered twice and the trauma radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice came through flat and clipped, the way it always did when something was genuinely wrong rather than just loud. Incoming GSW. 3 rounds. High velocity, chest and abdomen. ETA, 4 minutes. Patient is conscious but deteriorating. Megan was already moving before the radio cut out. She pulled a trauma cart from the supply alcove, snapped on gloves, and started mentally running the checklist. Chest seals, decompression needles, blood type, O-neg on standby. Her hands moved fast. They always moved fast when it mattered. Behind her, Dr. Franklin Holt leaned against the nurse's station with his arms crossed and watched her without helping. Carter. His voice had that particular tone, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd already decided before she could respond. "Who authorized you to prep Bay 4? "Nobody," she said, without turning around. "Bay 1's occupied, Bay 2's still being cleaned from the last case, and Bay 3's got a non-critical head lack. Gunshot victim coming in hot needs the best room available. That's 4. I'll decide that." "You can decide it in 4 minutes when they roll through the door." She checked the suction line. "Or you can help me set up." He didn't help. Holt was 48 years old, board-certified in emergency medicine, and had held the attending position at Redwood Regional for 11 years. He was also the kind of doctor who used the phrase chain of command the way some people used religion, constantly, and mostly to avoid doing anything inconvenient. He'd been appointed to his current role by the hospital director, Dr. Garrison Vale, and the two of them operated in an easy, mutual arrangement where Holt deferred on anything that mattered, and Vale made sure Holt's name stayed on the right committees. Megan had worked under him for 3 years. In that time, he'd written her up twice, once for administering a medication dosage that was technically above protocol but clinically necessary, and once for insubordination, which meant she'd told him directly that his discharge decision on a sepsis patient was going to kill the man. The man had come back by ambulance 6 hours later, crashing. Holt had never mentioned it again. She'd stopped expecting acknowledgement a long time ago. The ambulance bay doors blew open at 11:47 p.m. The paramedics came in fast, 1 on each side of the gurney, and the third running alongside with a bag valve mask pressed to the patient's face. The man on the stretcher was big, over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, even under the trauma dressings. And his skin had the grayish, damp quality that meant blood pressure was somewhere bad. His eyes were half open, not unconscious, but close. 3 GSW, 2 to the right chest, 1 upper left abdomen, the lead paramedic called out. He was talking on scene, went quiet about 90 seconds ago. Pressure dropped en route. We got 1 large bore IV in the left AC, pushed a liter of saline, no improvement. Megan was already at the head of the gurney, hands checking the patient's jaw angle, eyes moving over the dressings. "Name?" she asked. "No ID on him. No wallet, no phone. He had a military-style dog tag, but it was damaged. We couldn't read the number." "All right." She didn't need more than that right now. "Let's move." They transferred him to the Bay 4 bed in a count of 3. Megan pulled the dressings to check the wounds while the paramedic rattled off the rest of the report. 2 of the entry wounds were chest, right side, both lateral, which meant the lung was almost certainly involved. The third was in the left upper quadrant, close to the spleen. She pressed 2 fingers below his rib cage, and he flinched hard, which told her the spleen was alive enough to hurt, which meant it might be salvageable. She reached for the ultrasound probe. "Carter." She didn't look up. "Carter." Holt's voice was closer now. He'd followed them in and was standing just inside the bay curtain, which she noticed but didn't address. "Step back." "I'm doing a fast exam. Give me 30 seconds. I said step back." He moved to her side, not to take over the probe, but to physically position himself between her and the patient, and she had to take a half step left to avoid a collision. "I'll assess from here." She set the probe down. Not because he was right. Because picking a fight with Holt at the bedside of a dying patient was a waste of time she didn't have. What she did instead was watch. She watched him look at the patient the way someone looks at a problem they've already decided not to solve. His eyes moved over the wounds, the monitors, the IV lines, and something in his posture settled, not into focus, into a kind of deliberate stillness. Penetrating trauma, hemodynamically unstable, unknown background, no identification, he said slowly. This man needs a surgical consult, not a trauma workup. He needs a chest tube and a trip to the OR, Megan said. In that order. His right lung is compromised and his abdomen has free fluid. He's bleeding internally right now. You're a nurse. I know what a hemothorax looks like, Dr. Holt. What you know, he said, not raising his voice, is your job description, which does not include diagnostics. He turned to the paramedic, who was hovering near the door looking like he wanted to be somewhere else. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll take it from here. The paramedics left. The curtain swung closed. Megan looked at the patient. His chest was moving in short, shallow pulls, the right side lagging on expansion. His blood pressure on the monitor read 84/52. His heart rate was 118. I'm placing a chest tube, she said. You are not. Someone has to. Holt looked at her the way adults look at children who've said something embarrassing in public. I've paged the surgical resident on call. We wait for consult. How long? However long it takes. His pressure is 84. He doesn't have, Megan. He used her first name the way men like him always did. Not warmly, but to make a point about hierarchy. I understand you want to help, but this patient's situation is complex, and there are factors here that are above your level of understanding. Stand down, or I will have you removed from this bay. She stared at him. There it was. Not a medical argument, not a clinical rationale, factors above your understanding. It was the kind of sentence designed to make her feel small enough to stop asking questions. She'd heard variations of it since her first week at Redwood Regional, from Holt, from the charge nurses who'd been there long enough to align their interests with administration. And most of all from Dr. Garrison Vale, the hospital director, who had a particular talent for making his preferences sound like policy and his preferences sound like law. The patient's monitor alarmed. Oxygen saturation dropping, 91, 89, 87. Megan made her decision. She reached past Holt, grabbed the chest tube kit from the crash cart, and tore it open. Carter, his O2 is dropping. We're out of time. She uncapped the betadine. You can write me up after. For 2 seconds, Holt didn't move. And in those 2 seconds, she saw something flicker across his face that wasn't anger. It was something more complicated, something that looked briefly like calculation. Then he stepped back. She worked fast. Local anesthetic in the intercostal space, skin incision, blunt dissection through the chest wall. Her hands moved with a confidence that wasn't arrogance, just repetition. She'd done this dozens of times. More, if she counted the months before Redwood Regional, in a life she never discussed with anyone here. The tube went in. Dark blood drained immediately into the collection chamber. A lot of it, more than she'd hoped, but less than she'd feared. The right lung began to reinflate. The oxygen saturation climbed back. 91, 93, 96. The patient's eyes opened. They were dark brown, and they focused on her with an intensity that didn't match someone half dead. He looked at her not like a patient looks at a nurse, but the way trained people look at each other when they're assessing threat and intent simultaneously. His lips moved. She leaned in. Kestrel, he said. His voice was barely a sound. Kestrel. 7. 4. Don't try to talk, she said. You're stable for now. We need to get you to surgery. "The drive," he said. And then his hand moved, just slightly, just enough, pressing against his left side, below the abdominal wound. Not clutching at the pain, pressing deliberately. "Don't let them—" His eyes closed. The monitor stayed steady. He was unconscious, not dead, but whatever he'd been trying to tell her had landed somewhere in the back of her mind and stayed there, lodged like a splinter. She turned to call for a surgical team and found herself facing Dr. Garrison Vale. She hadn't heard him come in. He was standing just inside the bay with his hands in his coat pockets and an expression that was perfectly, carefully neutral. He was 61, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looked good in hospital brochures, distinguished without being warm. He'd been director of Redwood Regional for 7 years, and in that time the hospital had won 3 regional quality awards and quietly settled 4 wrongful termination suits, none of which had made the local news. "Dr. Vale," she said, "this patient needs OR time. The chest tube is managing the hemothorax for now, but the abdominal bleed is still active. If we don't get him upstairs in the next—" "I'm aware of the situation," Vale said. "Then you know we need to move." "What I know," he said, "is that you performed an invasive procedure without attending authorization." He looked at Holt, who had retreated to the corner of the bay and was studying his tablet with unconvincing focus. "Dr. Holt, did you authorize a chest tube insertion?" Holt didn't look up. "I did not." "So noted." Vale looked back at Megan. "The patient has no identification, no consent on file, and no next of kin we can locate. Given the circumstances, the appropriate course is to stabilize and transfer to Mercy General in Portland. Portland is 90 minutes out. He'll be dead in 40. That is a clinical judgment that is not yours to make." She couldn't quite believe what she was hearing, not because it was the first time she'd watched an administrator override a medical decision for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. It wasn't, but because of the deliberateness of it, the stillness in Vale's face, the way Holt wouldn't look at her. "Who is this patient?" she said. "We don't know." "You came down here yourself at midnight for a John Doe with no insurance on file?" Vale's expression didn't change. "I'm the director of this hospital. I come down for anything I choose. I want the surgical team paged." "That's not your call." "Then whose call is it?" She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't bother softening it. "Because the attending is deferring to you, the patient is actively bleeding, and the two of you are standing here talking about a transfer that will kill him." For a moment, nobody spoke. The monitors beeped. The chest tube drained. Vale looked at her with something that had moved past neutral into something colder. "Megan," he said, "you are a fine nurse, but you have a pattern of making yourself the exception to institutional protocol, and I have been patient with that pattern for a long time." He paused. "I'm going to ask you to step out of this bay. A colleague will take over the patient's care." "I'm not leaving him." "That wasn't a request." "Then write it down," she said. "In the patient's chart, write that you personally ordered staff to step back from an actively bleeding trauma patient and decline surgical intervention. Put your name on that decision." Something shifted in his eyes. It was small, just a contraction, just a fraction of a second, but she caught it. He hadn't expected her to say that. He was used to people backing down before the documentation question came up. "You're going to want to be very careful," he said quietly. "I'm being careful about the right things," she said. He left the bay without another word. Holt followed 30 seconds later, without making eye contact. Megan stood alone with the patient, listening to the monitors, and understood, with the clarity of someone who has been in a bad situation before and recognizes the specific shape of it, that she had just crossed a line that wasn't going to uncross itself. She also understood that the patient's left hand was still pressed against his side. She pulled on fresh gloves and carefully, with 2 fingers, felt along the edge of the abdominal wound, not invasively, just the surface tissue. The entry wound was clean, the dressing intact, but there was a slight hardness under the skin slightly lateral to the wound track, something that didn't move the way bruised tissue moved. It was subtle enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking, or if you were deliberately not looking. She looked. In the next 40 minutes, 3 things happened. First, the surgical resident on call, a second-year named Marcus Webb, who looked like he'd been awake for 30 hours and probably had, appeared in the bay, reviewed the patient, and said, "He needs the OR. Why hasn't he gone up yet?" Megan told him. His expression went through several stages before settling on grim determination. He paged the attending surgeon directly. Second, a man in a dark suit appeared at the nurse's station and asked, in a very calm and polite voice, to speak with the physician managing the unidentified trauma patient in Bay 4. He said he was from a government agency. He didn't specify which one. He had no visible ID. Third, Dr. Vale returned to the ER, this time with the head of hospital security, a thick-necked man named Briggs, who had the demeanor of someone who enjoyed his job a little too much, and walked directly to Bay 4. "Ms. Carter," Vale said, "you're being relieved of this case, effective immediately." "The surgical resident has already paged Dr. Okafor," she said. "The OR is being prepped." "That order has been rescinded." She stared at him. "You can't rescind a surgical order. That's between the attending and the... I can do whatever is necessary to maintain the integrity of this institution's operations." Vale's voice was still quiet. That was the thing about him. He was always quiet. "Briggs, please escort Ms. Carter out of this bay." Briggs stepped forward. She held her ground for 3 seconds, long enough to make the point. Then she stepped back because she understood that a physical confrontation in a trauma bay accomplished nothing except giving them grounds to have her arrested. She walked out of Bay 4. She did not walk toward the exit. Instead, she walked to the supply corridor that ran behind the bays, pulled out her personal phone, and took 3 photographs. The monitor readings she'd been tracking, the timestamps on the chest tube documentation she'd filled out, and 1 photograph she wasn't supposed to have taken but took anyway, through the small porthole window in the bay door. It showed Vale standing at the patient's bedside, not performing any medical intervention, just standing there, and the man in the dark suit standing beside him. She looked at the photographs for a moment, then she put her phone in her scrubs pocket and thought about what the soldier had said. Kestrel. 7-4. Don't let them... She didn't know what Kestrel meant. She didn't know what was pressed against the inside of the patient's left side. She didn't know what the man in the suit wanted, or why Garrison Vale, who had never come down to the ER for anything, had appeared twice in 1 hour for an unidentified John Doe. What she knew was this: the patient had been fighting to live when he came in. His vitals, now stabilized by the chest tube, suggested someone who was not ready to die, and every decision being made around him, by people with more authority than her, was pushing in one direction. She walked back to the nurse's station and picked up the patient chart, intending to finish documenting her interventions before they locked her out of the system. That was when she saw the medication order that had been entered in the last 10 minutes, under Dr. Holt's credentials. It was a sedation order. The dosage was wrong, not slightly wrong, not a rounding error or a unit mistake, the kind of wrong that a board-certified emergency physician with 11 years of experience did not make accidentally, unless they were doing it on purpose. Megan looked at the dosage. She looked at the patient's current weight estimate from triage. She ran the calculation in her head the same way she'd been running calculations since she was 22 years old in a place very different from this hospital, where getting the numbers wrong had consequences that couldn't be papered over with an incident report. At that dosage, given the patient's current blood pressure, his respiratory drive would fail within minutes of administration. It would look like a complication. It would look like the trauma was too severe. It would look like exactly what Vale had predicted when he said the patient should be transferred, an unstable case that didn't survive. She pulled the chart. She went to the Pyxis medication cabinet and flagged the order as requiring pharmacist verification before dispensing, which was within her authority as a licensed nurse, and which would delay administration by a minimum of 15 minutes. Then she walked back to Bay 4, pushed open the door before Briggs could stop her, and looked directly at Garrison Vale. "The medication order in the system has a dosage error," she said. "I flagged it for pharmacy review. If anyone administers that medication before the review is complete, it'll be on the record that they did it after the flag was placed." Vale stared at her. The man in the dark suit had his eyes on her phone pocket. "Get her out," Vale said. Briggs grabbed her arm. She let herself be walked out. Because the flag was placed. Because the documentation existed. Because she'd done what she could do with the tools she had, and now she needed to think about the next 30 minutes very carefully. They walked her to the back employee entrance. Not the main lobby, the back, which told her they didn't want witnesses. Briggs swiped her badge through the reader and her access terminated with a soft final click. "Your personal items will be forwarded," he said. "Don't come back on hospital property." She stood in the parking lot, in the November cold, in her scrubs, without a jacket. Behind her, through the emergency room windows, she could see the light in Bay 4. Still on. The patient still inside. She pulled out her phone. She looked at the photograph of Vale and the man in the suit. Then she looked at her call history and found a number she hadn't dialed in 3 years. She started walking to her car. The parking lot was quiet except for the wind and the distant sound of a helicopter, somewhere far off to the northwest, getting closer. She'd gone maybe 40 feet when the black SUV rolled in from the far entrance, headlights cutting across the lot, moving slowly. Not like someone looking for a parking space, like someone who already knew where she was going to be. It stopped. The driver didn't get out. A second SUV pulled in from the other side. Megan stopped walking. She looked at her phone. She looked at the SUVs. She looked at the emergency room door behind her. Oh, locked now, her badge dead. And at the dark street beyond the parking lot exit, 50 feet away. Then she heard the helicopter. It wasn't far off anymore. It was directly overhead, dropping fast, and it wasn't a medical helicopter. The sound was wrong. The silhouette was wrong. The lights were wrong. The SUV's doors opened. Megan ran. She ran the way she hadn't run in 3 years, not panicked, not blind, but low and fast with her eyes already reading the lot ahead of her for cover, angles, and exits. The instinct came back without asking permission, the way muscle memory always does when the situation is serious enough. The 2 men from the first SUV were out and moving, not sprinting. They were too professional for that, too confident in the geometry of the situation, but closing the distance with the deliberate pace of people who believed they had the exits covered. The second vehicle had swung to block the main parking lot entrance. Megan cut left toward the narrow service lane that ran along the hospital's east wing, because she'd walked that lane 100 times and she knew it ended at a chain-link gate that was almost never padlocked after the maintenance crew left. Almost. The gate was padlocked. She hit it at full speed with both hands, rattling it hard, fingers finding the chain. The lock was a basic keyed model, not a combination, which meant nothing to her except that she couldn't open it. She turned. The 2 men were 30 feet back, not hurrying. One of them had his right hand moving toward his jacket. Above her, the helicopter circled. Its spotlight swept the far end of the lot but hadn't reached the service lane yet. She looked up at the chain link. 8 feet, maybe 8.5. She hadn't climbed a fence in years. Her shoulders still had the hardware from a surgery she didn't talk about. She grabbed the chain link anyway and went up fast, not gracefully. 1 foot slipped on the second rung and she caught herself with her forearms, which hurt, and she cleared the top in a way that would leave marks on her palms, and she did not care at all. She dropped to the other side on the grass embankment, rolled once, came up running. The service road behind the hospital emptied onto Crescent Mill Road, which ran north toward the edge of Ashford's small downtown district. She crossed it without stopping, ducked between 2 parked trucks in the lot behind a closed hardware store, and finally, for the first time since the parking lot, stopped moving. Her breathing was harder than she wanted it to be. Her palms were bleeding lightly where the chain link had cut them. She pressed them against her scrub pants and made herself slow the breath down, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd been taught in a different life by a medic instructor who'd said, "The first thing fear steals is your oxygen, and you need all of it." She could still hear the helicopter. It was circling the hospital, not expanding the search yet. She had minutes, not many. Her car was still in the hospital lot, which meant it was either being watched or about to be. Her apartment was 12 minutes away by foot, and whoever these people were, if they had access to hospital personnel records, and she had to assume they did, given how quickly Vale had coordinated with them, they had her address. She pulled out her phone and looked at it. The screen had cracked at some point, a thin diagonal fracture across the lower corner, still functional. She opened her call history. The number she was looking at belonged to a man named Roy Decker. She'd worked with Roy for 2 years before Redwood Regional, in a context that had nothing to do with civilian nursing, and she'd called him exactly once in the years since, when she'd first moved to Ashford and wanted exactly one person to know where she was, just in case. He'd picked up on the second ring that time. He'd said, "Good to know," and that was the end of the conversation. She pressed call. It rang 4 times. She was composing a voicemail in her head when he picked up. Carter. Not a question. He knew her number, apparently still had it saved. I have a problem, she said. I can hear that. A pause. How bad? Unknown military patient at Redwood Regional. 3 GSW. Hospital director tried to let him die. I stabilized him and got walked out. Now there are 2 black SUVs and a helicopter looking for me in the parking lot. Silence for 3 seconds. You still have your phone on you? Yes. They have your number? She hadn't thought about that. If they'd pulled her personnel file, her number was in it. Probably. This call is already a problem. Listen to me. Do you have what they're looking for? She almost said, I don't know what they're looking for. But the soldier's hand pressing against his side came back to her, and the slight firmness she'd felt beneath the wound, and she said, Not yet. Then you need to make a decision in the next 30 seconds about whether you're going to walk away from this or stay in it, because after that point, the decision gets made for you. His voice was level. Not calm, exactly. Roy was never what she'd call calm, but controlled. What do you want to do? She looked at her cracked phone screen. She thought about the dosage and the medication order. She thought about what happened to a man with a dropping blood pressure if that dosage was administered and no one was there to see it. I'm staying in it, she said. Okay. He exhaled once. Kill your phone's location services right now and pull the SIM if you can. Use the phone for pictures and nothing else until I get eyes on the situation. Can you get back into that hospital? My badge is dead. That's not what I asked. She thought about it. The maintenance entrance on the south side used a separate keypad system that ran on a different access tier. Facilities, not clinical staff. She'd learned the code 8 months ago when the badge reader had malfunctioned during a late shift and a janitor named Dolph had punched it in without thinking. She'd watched his hands without meaning to, the way she always watched hands, and the numbers had stayed with her the way numbers always did. Maybe, she said. Then get back in there, Roy said. Whatever that soldier was carrying, it's still in the building. And if they're this hard after you, it means they think you already have it. Another pause. Move fast, Carter. I'll make some calls. The line went dead. She pulled her SIM card, dropped it between the slats of a storm drain, and put the phone back in her pocket. Then she moved. The south maintenance entrance was on the opposite end of the building from where she'd gone over the fence, which meant crossing 200 feet of open space between the hardware store lot and the hospital's rear perimeter. She did it in pieces, truck to truck, shadow to shadow, with the helicopter's spotlight doing lazy sweeps over the main lot on the far side of the building. By the time she reached the maintenance door, her palms had stopped bleeding and her breathing was controlled, and she was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline and wasn't quite calm, but was somewhere between them. A state she recognized from years ago and hadn't missed until this exact moment when she needed it. The keypad. She entered the 6-digit code. The light went green. The door clicked. She was back inside. The south maintenance corridor was dim and smelled like floor stripper. She moved through it toward the central service hub, where the elevator banks for non-patient use were located. She needed Bay 4. She needed to get there without crossing through the main ER corridor, which would put her in view of the nurses' station and whoever Vale had stationed there. She took the back elevator to the ground floor, came out through the supply alcove that connected to the rear of the emergency department, and pressed herself against the wall, listening. Voices, 2, maybe 3, coming from the direction of Bay 4. Not medical voices, not the quick task-focused shorthand of clinical staff mid-procedure. These were quieter, more measured, the kind of voices people use when they're giving instructions rather than performing them. She moved to the bay door and looked through the porthole. The patient was still on the bed, still monitored. His vitals on the display were poor, worse than when she'd left. And she could see from the drip line that something was running into his IV that hadn't been there 40 minutes ago. The man in the dark suit was standing near the window. Another man she hadn't seen before was near the door. Between them, with his back to Megan, stood Dr. Vale. She didn't have a badge to swipe, but the bay doors in the ER were push-pull in an emergency. Fire safety protocol, bypassing the electronic lock if you hit the manual plate at the right angle. She'd done it once before during a drill. She did it again now. The door swung open and she was inside before any of them had finished turning around. Get out! Vale said. The control in his voice had frayed slightly at the edges. She ignored him and went directly to the IV line, checking the drip rate, reading the label on the hanging bag. It wasn't the sedation order she'd flagged. This was something else. Unlabeled. Hung after she'd left. Not in the chart. What is this, Risa? She said. That's not your concern. It's running into a man's vein, which makes it my concern. She reached for the line. The man near the door moved forward, and she turned to look at him with an expression that made him pause. It wasn't threat. She didn't have anything to threaten him with. It was just the particular look of someone who has made a decision all the way down to the bone and is not interested in negotiation. He paused. She clamped the IV line. You have no idea what you're walking into, Vale said. His voice had dropped lower. Not angry, something past angry. This man was carrying materials that are a direct threat to national security. There are people whose job it is to manage that situation, and you are actively obstructing. He's a patient, she said. Whatever he was carrying, he is a patient, and you are running an unlabeled medication into his IV without documentation. That's not national security. That's murder with a medical license. The man in the dark suit spoke for the first time. His voice was even and patient, the kind of patient that meant he'd done this before. Ms. Carter, my name is Harlan Voss. I represent an agency with oversight over the materials this individual was transporting. I'm going to need you to step away from that IV line and exit this room. Show me a badge. That's not how this works. Then this isn't how this works either. She put her hand on the patient's wrist and checked his pulse manually because she didn't trust the monitor anymore. It was there, fast, thready, but there. His skin was cold. She pulled the blanket up from the foot of the bed and covered him. Harlan Voss watched her do it. You're making a very serious mistake, he said. Probably, she said. I've made them before. She looked at the patient's left side, the area he'd been pressing on, the area with the slight firmness beneath the wound. She needed about 2 minutes alone with him. She was not going to get 2 minutes alone with him. What she got instead was 30 seconds, because that was when the emergency radio in the hallway crackled with a code she hadn't heard in a long time. Not a hospital code, not a fire code, not a trauma activation, but a specific sequence of tones that she recognized from a completely different context, from a completely different version of her life. She recognized it because she'd been trained to. The 3 men in the room recognized it too, because all of them looked toward the hallway at the same time with expressions ranging from surprise to something closer to alarm. Outside, through the ER's main sliding doors, a vehicle had pulled up, then another, and the sound that came with them, the low, distinctive rumble of military transport engines, not civilian SUVs, filled the ambulance bay with something that changed the pressure of the room entirely. Harlan Voss straightened his jacket. Vale took one step back toward the wall. The man near the door moved toward the window instead and looked out. Megan stayed where she was, next to the patient, her hand still on the clamped IV line, and watched the ER entrance. The sliding doors opened. The first person through them was a woman in full military field uniform, not hospital dress, not a liaison officer setup, actual tactical gear with a unit patch Megan couldn't read from here. She was followed by 2 more personnel, and then a man in his 50s with the kind of bearing that didn't require a rank insignia to communicate authority, though he had those too. He looked around the ER with the focused efficiency of someone taking inventory, not sightseeing. His eyes moved to Bay 4. He moved toward it. Harlan Voss stepped into the corridor to intercept him. Colonel? Step aside, Mr. Voss. The voice didn't carry. It didn't need to. Voss didn't move immediately. This is an active agency operation. You don't have jurisdiction over. I have a soldier in there. The colonel's voice was flat and absolutely certain. Move. Voss moved. The colonel came through the bay door, his 2 personnel flanking, and looked at the room. Vale against the wall, the unknown man near the window, and Megan standing at the bedside with her hand on the IV line. He looked at Megan for exactly 2 seconds. Who are you? He said. Megan Carter, ER nurse. He looked at the clamped IV line. He looked at Vale. He looked at the unlabeled bag. Did you clamp that? Yes. When? About 4 minutes ago. Before that, something was running into him, and I couldn't identify it from the chart because it wasn't in the chart. The colonel turned to look at Vale with an expression that did not require elaboration. Vale said, "This is a hospital procedure authorized under emergency." "Sergeant Karras," the colonel said, not looking away from Vale, "please ensure Dr. Vale and his associate don't leave this floor." The woman in tactical gear, Karras, moved to the door with a quiet competence that made it very clear the instruction would be followed. The colonel came to the bedside. He looked at the patient, really looked at him, the way someone looks at a person they know. And something in his face changed, just slightly, the way faces change when the situation becomes personal rather than tactical. "Is he going to make it?" he said. Not to Vale, to Megan. She looked at the monitors, she looked at the patient's color, his breathing, the state of the chest tube drainage. She thought about the abdominal bleed, still not surgically addressed, still active at some level she couldn't quantify from the outside. "Not without surgery," she said. "He's been stable since I placed the chest tube, but the abdominal wound needs to be addressed in the OR. I've been trying to get him there for the last hour and a half." "Why hasn't he gone?" She looked at Vale. The colonel followed her eyes. "Get me a surgical team," he said to Karras, who was already on a radio. Then he looked back at Megan. "You placed the chest tube?" "Yes." "You stabilized him when he came in?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment in a way that felt like he was reading something. "Who trained you?" She met his eyes. "That's a longer conversation." "We'll have it," he said. Not as a threat, as a statement of fact. Behind him, through the bay window, she could see Harlan Voss in the corridor, speaking into a phone with the controlled urgency of someone reporting upward that a situation had gotten away from them. She could see two of the colonel's personnel stationed at the ER entrance. She could see hospital security, Briggs included, standing near the nurses' station looking very uncertain about what their job description covered right now. And she could see at the edge of her peripheral vision the patient's left hand moving. She looked down. His eyes weren't open. He wasn't conscious in any meaningful sense. But his hand had moved, the same deliberate pressure against his left side that she'd seen when he first came in, when he'd said the drive with the last of his available breath. She looked at the colonel. "There's something inside him," she said. He went still. "Below the abdominal wound, lateral to the tract. I felt it when I first assessed him. It's not anatomical. It's too firm, too regular." She watched his face. "He knew it was there. He pressed on it when he was conscious. He told me not to let them—" She stopped. He didn't finish. The colonel's expression told her she'd just said something that mattered enormously. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a small radio, and said 3 words into it that she didn't recognize as English. Whatever those words were, the response was immediate. She could hear it, even muffled through the receiver, and the colonel's jaw set. "We need that surgical team now," he said to Karras. "Priority 1. 2 minutes out," Karras said. Megan looked at the patient. She looked at the unlabeled IV bag she'd clamped. She looked at the colonel, who was now running the room with the quiet authority of someone who had handled worse situations than this and come out the other side, but who was also, she could see, operating under a time pressure that hadn't been visible until about 30 seconds ago. "Whatever's inside him," she said, "they were going to let him die to keep it from reaching you." "Yes," the colonel said. Vale was in on it. "Yes. And the man outside, Voss, that," the colonel said, "is a more complicated answer." She nodded. She didn't push it. There was a time for answers, and this wasn't it. What she did not expect, what she was entirely unprepared for, was the sound from the ER entrance. Not the surgical team, not more military vehicles. Glass, and then an alarm, and then the very specific sound of people moving fast in a way that meant they were not hospital staff and not the colonel's people. Karras was already at the door. "Colonel, we have a breach. East entrance. 4, maybe 5 personnel." The colonel looked at Megan. "Can you move him?" he said. She looked at the patient, the IV lines, the chest tube, the monitor leads, the fragile and temporary stability she'd constructed around a man who was still bleeding somewhere inside. "Not safely," she said. "Can you move him without killing him?" That was a different question. She grabbed the bed rail. Yes, she said, and meant it, and hoped she was right. She moved fast. Not recklessly, but with the compressed efficiency of someone prioritizing in real time. The chest tube stayed. Pulling it would collapse the lung faster than anything else could. She disconnected the monitoring leads one by one, leaving the pulse ox clamped to his finger because she needed something, even just the number on a portable unit. She capped the IV port, left the line in, and swapped the unlabeled bag off the pole entirely, dropping it on the bed near his feet as evidence she was not leaving behind. The Foley catheter she disconnected and clamped. It wasn't ideal. Nothing about this was ideal. I need a portable monitor, she said to no one specific, loudly enough to carry. One of the colonel's personnel, a young man who hadn't been introduced and didn't need to be, was already pulling one from the crash cart in the hallway and wheeling it in. She clipped the leads back on in under 40 seconds. Heart rate, 122. O2 sat, 93. Blood pressure she wouldn't have until she got a cuff on him, which wasn't happening in the next 30 seconds. The sound from the east entrance had changed, not louder but more organized, which was worse. Disorganized noise meant confusion. Organized noise meant people who knew what they were doing and were doing it on a timeline. How many exits does this floor have? The colonel asked her. 4. Main entrance, ambulance bay, east corridor, and the south maintenance door. She released the bed brake. The south maintenance door I came in through. The keypad code is still active. They don't know I used it or they'd have locked it down already. How far to the service elevator from here? 40 feet through the supply corridor. He made a decision in the way experienced people make decisions, without visible deliberation, just a slight forward shift of weight. We move now. Karas, hold the east corridor. Morrison on the bed. The young man who'd brought the monitor moved to the foot of the gurney. The colonel took the other side. Megan pushed from the head. They went through the bay door and turned left, away from the main corridor, into the supply passage that smelled of floor stripper and industrial cleaning solution. The gurney wheels were loud on the concrete floor. There was no way around that, and the portable monitor beeped with every heartbeat, which felt aggressively conspicuous, and also told her the patient was still alive, so she left it on. Behind them, from the east corridor, she heard Karas's voice give one sharp command, followed by a sound that was not a gunshot but was adjacent to one, a taser, she thought, or a stun device of some kind. And then the specific noise of a large body hitting a wall and going down. Keep moving, the colonel said quietly. They moved. The service elevator was a freight model, wide enough for the gurney with room on either side, and it had the particular slowness of all hospital freight elevators, as though the machinery had been installed during an era when urgency was considered optional. The colonel hit the button for the third floor. Surgical, she assumed he'd already confirmed OR availability through Karas's radio call, and the doors slid shut. In the enclosed space, the beeping of the portable monitor was very loud. The colonel looked at the patient for a moment, then at Megan. His name is Darian Wolfe, he said. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Special Forces Group. He's been embedded for 11 months. She absorbed this without comment. It explained the physical conditioning, the focus in his eyes when he'd looked at her. It explained the code word, kestrel, and the deliberate pressure of his hand against the concealed object in his side. What was he carrying? She asked. A data drive. Encapsulated surgical implant placed before deployment. Standard protocol for long-term embedded operations. If the operative is captured, the materials are harder to locate and remove than a pocket or a boot. He paused. The drive contains 11 months of documented intelligence on a procurement network that has been redirecting defense contracts and selling classified hardware specifications to foreign buyers. Names, dates, transaction records, communication logs. She looked at him. And Vale was part of it. Vale's hospital has been a transit point. Medical shipments as cover. We'd been trying to confirm the connection for 4 months. His expression didn't change, but something behind it tightened. Wolfe was coming in with everything we needed to dismantle it. 3 people knew his route. Whoever gave it up knew enough to position assets in Ashford specifically, which means the breach is inside our own structure. The elevator stopped. 3rd floor. They moved the gurney out and down the hall toward the OR suites. A surgical team was already assembled outside OR2. She could see them through the window, gowned, gloved, waiting with the particular controlled tension of people who'd been told to be ready without being told for what. The attending surgeon was a woman Megan vaguely recognized from hospital events, but had never worked with, Dr. Petra Solano, general surgery, whose reputation in the department was that she was technically excellent and personally difficult in the way that genuinely skilled surgeons sometimes were. Solano looked at the patient, at the chest tube, at the portable monitor, and then at Megan in her street-dirty scrubs with blood on her palms. "You placed the chest tube?" "Yes." "How long ago?" "About 90 minutes. Solano looked at the drainage output. "Output is slowing. Good. Abdominal bleed still active?" "I don't have imaging, but on presentation the fast showed free fluid in Morrison's pouch, and he guarded on palpation of the left upper quadrant. The spleen is the most likely source." "You did the fast exam?" "Before the attending pulled me off the case." Solano's eyes moved from the patient to the colonel to Megan and back to the patient. She made the same kind of decision the colonel had made. Forward shift, no visible deliberation. "Get him in." She looked at Megan. "You're scrubbing in." It was not a question. "I'm not a surgeon," Megan said. "I didn't ask if you were a surgeon. I asked you to scrub in. I have a first-year resident who's never seen a splenography outside of a textbook and a tech who's solid, but has never worked a trauma case this complex. You clearly know what you're doing, and I want experienced hands in that room." Solano was already moving toward the scrub sink. "You can tell me why a floor nurse has combat medic hands while we work." Megan looked at the colonel. He gave her the smallest nod. She followed Solano to the scrub sink. The water was cold, and she scrubbed longer than the minimum required 30 seconds. Not from habit, but because her palms were still lightly abraded from the fence, and she needed to know they were clean before she put them inside a body cavity. She watched her own hands under the water and thought about the last time she'd stood at a scrub sink before a trauma surgery, which had been in a forward operating base medical facility in a country she wasn't officially supposed to have been in, wearing a uniform that nobody in Ashford, Oregon knew existed. She'd left that life because she'd had to, and she hadn't looked back because looking back didn't accomplish anything useful. But it was there, all of it. The training, the repetition, the 300-odd trauma assists, and the 47 times she'd been the most qualified person in a very bad situation and had acted accordingly. It didn't go away just because you moved to a small town and took a floor nursing job and let people like Franklin Holt call you just a nurse until you almost started to believe them. Almost. She backed through the OR door with her hands up, and the scrub tech gloved and gowned her without needing to be asked. The next 2 hours and 14 minutes were the most focused she'd been in 3 years. Solano was technically excellent, and she was also right about her resident, who was visibly operating at the edge of his competency and managing it by going very still and very quiet. The spleen was the primary source, a grade 3 laceration, manageable but actively bleeding. And Solano moved through the repair with efficient precision while Megan managed the field, anticipated instrument needs, and twice quietly said something that redirected the suction before it became a visibility problem. Neither of them commented on the dynamic. It just settled into place, the way functional working relationships settle when both people are paying attention to the patient and not to each other. They found the implanted drive during abdominal exploration, a smooth ovoid capsule, roughly the size of a large vitamin, encased in a biologically inert polymer shell and positioned in a small surgically created pocket in the posterior abdominal wall, away from major vessels. It was professionally done. Whoever had placed it knew anatomy and had planned for exactly this kind of retrieval challenge. Solano looked at it in the retractor field. "That's not a tumor." "No," Megan said. "Do I want to know what it is?" "Probably not right now." Solano held her gaze for a moment. "Does it come out?" Megan thought about the colonel's face when she'd told him what she'd felt, the slight forward shift that meant this was what everything had been moving toward. "Yes, and it needs to go directly to the military officer waiting outside this OR. Don't let anyone else touch it." Solano retrieved it cleanly, dropped it into a sterile basin, and kept moving. Darian Wolf's spleen held. His pressure stabilized during the repair, climbing from the low 80s into the 90s and settling there with the cautious improvement of a body that had been losing blood for too long and was tentatively deciding it might survive after all. They addressed two smaller bleeders in the mesentery, irrigated and closed in layers. The chest tube drainage had slowed to a trickle by the time they were closing the abdomen, which meant the lung was doing its job. He was going to make it. She knew it with the same flat certainty she knew other things. Not hope, not optimism, just the clinical recognition of a patient who had fought hard enough and received adequate intervention barely early enough. He would need days in the ICU. His recovery would not be fast or easy, but he was going to make it. When they moved him to the recovery bay, Megan stripped her gloves and walked out of the OR into the hallway and stood there for a moment with her back against the wall, not collapsing exactly, just allowing herself 20 seconds of not doing anything. The colonel was in the hallway. He was holding the sterile basin with the capsule inside, and his expression had done something she hadn't seen from him yet. It had lost a fraction of its operational composure, just briefly, in the way that happens when something you've been working toward for a very long time finally arrives. He looked at her. "He's stable," she said. The colonel was quiet for a moment. "Good." He handed the basin to the young soldier who'd helped with the gurney, Morrison, and said something to him in a low voice. Morrison moved immediately toward the stairwell with the specific urgency of someone carrying something that needed to be somewhere else right now. Then the colonel looked back at Megan. "You want to tell me about those hands?" he said. She looked at him. "Solano called down while you were still closing," he said. "Said she'd never seen a nurse anticipate a trauma field like that. Asked me who you were." He paused. "I told her I'd find out." She could have deflected. She'd been deflecting for 3 years, letting people at Redwood Regional see only what she'd shown them. Competent nurse, occasional inconvenience, easy to dismiss. The deflection had become habitual, and habits were hard to break even when the situation had made them entirely irrelevant. She decided it was time to break it. 4 years in the Army, she said. 6, 8W, combat medic. Then 3 years in a special operations support role. I was attached to SF units as a trauma specialist. I wasn't SF myself, but I was with them for long enough that I learned what they needed someone to know. She looked at the wall across from her. I left on a medical discharge. Shoulder. The surgery was fine, but they couldn't certify me for field work anymore. And field work was the only part I cared about, so I made the call before they made it for me. She paused. I came to Ashford because it was small and quiet and nobody here knew me, which seemed like a good idea at the time. The colonel listened to all of this without interrupting. Why nursing? He said. With that background, you could have gone. I know what I could have gone into, she said. I chose nursing because it puts me in rooms where people are dying and lets me do something about it. The rest of it, she gestured vaguely at the building around her. I didn't plan for. He nodded slowly. Who's Roy Decker? She blinked. You know Roy? I know of him. His name came up in a communication flagged to my unit about 90 minutes ago. Someone made calls on your behalf. She almost smiled and didn't quite. Roy was my team's comms specialist. We kept in touch. She looked at the colonel directly. Did he help? He confirmed your identity and your service record, which was useful when I had to explain to the hospital administrator why we were occupying his surgical floor. He paused, and he sent a secondary transmission to the Inspector General's office with documentation of Vale's communications over the last 6 weeks. Apparently he's been pulling threads. She stared at him. Roy sent, Your friend is thorough, the colonel said. She absorbed this. Somewhere in the building below them, things were happening that she wasn't tracking. The colonel's personnel were securing floors. Harlan Voss was in a conversation he wasn't enjoying. Briggs from hospital security was presumably trying to figure out which side of the situation represented a viable career. Franklin Holt was probably in a conference room with very bad lighting and a growing understanding that his decision to document his refusal of authorization for her chest tube had created a paper trail pointing directly at himself. And Garrison Vale, Dr. Garrison Vale, 7 years as director of Redwood Regional Medical Center, 3 quality awards, 4 settled lawsuits, was somewhere on the ground floor being told that the night had not gone the way he'd planned. She was thinking about all of this when Karis came up the stairwell at a controlled jog, which was the first time Megan had seen her move at anything other than the deliberate pace of someone who didn't need to hurry because she was already ahead of the situation. "Colonel," Kara said, "we have a problem." "What kind?" "The breach. The one inside our own structure you mentioned." She looked at Megan briefly, decided something, and looked back at the colonel. "We got a communication log off Voss's phone before his team's lawyer shut it down. He's been in contact with 3 people in our own chain. One of them is the officer who authorized this recovery operation." The colonel's expression didn't change. "Which means," Karas continued, "that Wolf's route wasn't compromised from outside. It was handed off from inside." She paused. "And whoever authorized our deployment tonight may have done it specifically to control the recovery of that drive, rather than let it reach proper command." Megan looked at the colonel. Something had shifted in his face. Not panic, not even alarm, but the particular recalibration of a man who has just understood that the situation he thought he was managing has a floor he hasn't reached yet. "Where's the drive now?" he said. Where is Morrison right now exactly?" Karis's radio crackled before she could answer, and then it went silent in the specific way that radios go silent when the person on the other end has stopped transmitting, which was not the same as the silence of no answer. The colonel was already moving. Megan moved with him because the alternative was standing in the hallway waiting to find out what happened, and she had never been good at that. They took the stairs at a pace that wasn't running but was close enough. Second floor, first floor, through the door into the main corridor. And there was Morrison standing near the supply corridor junction with his hands visible and his posture extremely deliberate, in the way people stand when someone has told them to stand exactly like that. The man standing across from him was in civilian clothes. He had a sidearm visible at his hip and credentials in his other hand that he was holding up for anyone watching, and he was speaking in the low, controlled tone of someone who expects to be obeyed. But in his right hand, the one without the credentials, he was holding the sterile basin, the drive. The colonel stopped. The man in civilian clothes looked at him. He wasn't young, mid-40s, the kind of face that had spent a long time not showing what it was thinking, which meant he'd had a lot of practice. He didn't look frightened. He looked like a person who has planned for this contingency and has decided that the plan still works. "Colonel Reeves," he said, "you need to stand down and let me take custody of this material. I have authorization from..." "From whom?" the colonel said. "From the department level above your unit. Show me the authorization. It's classified at a tier above your clearance." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere deeper in the building, Megan could hear the sounds of the colonel's other personnel. Footsteps, a radio burst, doors. But here, in this junction, it was just the 4 of them and a sterile basin and whatever happened next. She looked at the drive in the man's hand. She looked at Morrison, whose eyes were steady and whose hands had not moved. She looked at the colonel, who was doing the thing that competent people do in impossible situations. Not freezing, not escalating, but calculating, buying seconds, running the angles. And she looked at the man in civilian clothes, who was watching the colonel and had not looked at her since they'd walked in. That was a mistake. She stepped left, angling behind Morrison, and said, "Can I ask you something?" The man looked at her. Reflex. She was a voice, a movement, an unexpected variable. In the half-second he looked at her, the colonel moved. It was not a dramatic movement. It was precise and fast and economic in the way that trained people move when they have decided that talking is finished. One step forward, one hand on the wrist holding the basin, and the specific application of force that separates an object from a hand without requiring a larger confrontation than necessary. The basin came free. The man reacted, pulled back, reached for the sidearm, and then Karas was there, from the corridor behind him, one hand on his weapon arm, and the moment passed into the kind of controlled standoff that gets resolved by paperwork rather than further escalation. Colonel Reeves held the sterile basin. He looked at Megan. She looked back at him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Morrison exhaled very slowly through his nose and said, "I'm glad you came down the stairs." "So am I," she said. The colonel looked at the drive in the basin. He looked at the man now being restrained by Karas. He looked at Megan with an expression that was several things at once: recognition, recalibration, something that was not quite gratitude but was in the same territory. I need to get this to a secure line, he said. Off-site. Not through any channel that Voss or this individual has had access to. He paused. Do you know anywhere in Ashford that is not this hospital and is not on record as having any connection to this operation? She thought about it. Yes, she said. How far? 12 minutes on foot, less if you have a vehicle. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than the situation strictly required. Miss Carter, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him until now. Not authority exactly, but something closer to the particular respect that passes between people who have been in difficult situations and recognized each other's competence under pressure. I think you should come with us. She was about to answer when the lights in the corridor went out. All of them. Simultaneously. The backup generators kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in dim red emergency lighting. And in that 3 seconds of complete darkness, from somewhere above them on the surgical floor, there was a single sharp sound that she recognized immediately and that made her stomach drop. A gunshot. And then Darien Wolf's recovery bay alarm started screaming. She was already running before the colonel gave any order. The stairwell door hit the wall when she pushed through it, and she took the stairs 2 at a time in the red emergency light, her hand trailing the railing not for support, but for orientation because the shadows were deep and the angles were wrong in the dim crimson wash. Behind her, she heard the colonel's footsteps and Morrison's, and Karras's voice dropping into a radio frequency with clipped hard syllables that meant things were being repositioned right now. 3rd floor. She came through the door into the surgical corridor and turned toward the recovery bay without slowing, and she could already hear it. The bay alarm, continuous and sharp, and underneath it a second sound that was worse, which was the sound of someone trying to control a situation and not quite managing it. The recovery bay door was open. She went in. The nurse who'd been assigned to Wolf's post-op care, a woman named Patrice who Megan knew from shared shifts, solid and competent, was pressed against the far wall with both hands raised and an expression on her face that was not panic, but was very close to it. The monitoring equipment was alarming because 2 of the leads had been pulled loose, not because Wolf's condition had crashed. Wolf himself was still on the bed, still intubated, still sedated from surgery. He hadn't moved and couldn't. The man standing between Patrice and the bed was not anyone Megan recognized. He was 40, approximately, in clothes that read as civilian but fit the way clothes fit on people who spend time in kit. Too well through the shoulders, not well enough at the cuffs. He had a handgun, and he was holding it with the practiced looseness of someone who knew how to use it and was currently deciding whether this situation required that. His eyes moved to Megan when she came through the door, and he made a rapid assessment that she could track, nurse, no weapon, non-threat, and dismissed her accordingly. That assessment was going to be a problem for him. Nobody else comes in, he said. His voice was directed at the door behind her. There's a colonel behind me, she said, keeping her own voice level and her hands visible at her sides. And at least 2 armed personnel. So the math on this situation is not going in a good direction for you. She took 1 step sideways, not toward him, just angling, putting herself between his sight line to the door and the patient on the bed. What do you want? The drive. It's not in this room. I know that. His eyes moved to her face. But you know where it is. I really don't. You were with Reeves in the corridor. You were with him when he recovered it from Morrison. You know where he's taking it. She looked at him steadily. And you think I'm going to tell you that because you have a gun. I think you're going to tell me that because there is a critically ill patient on that bed, and you are the kind of person who won't let him get hurt if there's any way to prevent it. He said it without particular menace, just as a factual reading of the situation. He wasn't wrong, which was the frustrating part. So let's not waste each other's time. Behind her, at the door, she could feel the colonel's presence, not in the room, just at the threshold, and she understood without turning that he was holding his personnel back, that he was reading the geometry and making the same calculation she was making, which was that a gunman in a recovery bay with a sedated patient and a civilian nurse against the wall was not a situation that improved with escalation. I'll tell you one thing, she said. The man waited. Whatever information you think I have, it's already been transmitted. Reeves didn't wait for a secure location. He used the OR satellite relay. It's been off this property for 12 minutes. She watched his face. So the drive itself is already redundant. The data is at command, which means you are standing in a hospital recovery room with a gun for no remaining operational purpose. It wasn't entirely true. She didn't know what Reeves had done with the drive in the last 10 minutes because she'd been coming up the stairs. But the man in front of her didn't know that she didn't know. And the part about the satellite relay sounded specific enough to be real, and specific details were what made lies hold under pressure. She'd learned that in a context she didn't talk about. His jaw moved slightly. Recalculating. She pressed it. What happens to you next depends entirely on whether anyone has been hurt. Right now, Patrice is fine. Wolf is fine. The gun hasn't been fired in this room. She kept her voice completely even. If you put it down, that's the version of tonight you're going to answer for. If you don't... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He looked at her for 4 seconds. She counted. Then he looked at the door. Understanding, she thought, that whatever tactical advantage he'd had was gone, that the colonel's personnel were repositioned, that the corridor had changed in the last 3 minutes. He set the gun on the bed rail and put his hands up. The colonel came through the door at a pace that was not hurried but covered the distance in very few steps, and Morrison was beside him and had the weapon and had the man turned and controlled against the far wall before the room had fully processed what had happened. Patrice made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and not quite a laugh, somewhere between relief and the specific release of tension that comes after the kind of sustained fear that polishes itself into numbness. Megan went to the monitoring equipment and reconnected the leads. Wolf's heart rate, 88, steadier than before surgery. His color was better than it had been in the ER, which wasn't high praise but was measurable progress. She looked at the colonel. What you told him, he said, about the satellite relay. I needed something specific. Was any of it true? Some of it, she said. How much depends on what you actually did with the drive in the last 10 minutes. He looked at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, amused. We have a satellite uplink in the mobile command unit outside. I sent Morrison with the drive 6 minutes ago. He paused. It transmitted successfully 4 minutes ago. She absorbed this. So I told him something that turned out to be true. Near enough. Good, she said. I prefer that. Patrice had moved away from the wall and was checking Wolf's lines with hands that shook only slightly, which Megan thought showed considerable professional discipline given what the last 10 minutes had been. She caught Patrice's eye, and the other woman gave her a look that communicated several things. Gratitude, disbelief, and a question she wasn't ready to ask out loud yet. Megan didn't try to explain. There wasn't a short version. The man Morrison had restrained, who had not given his name and showed no inclination to, was walked out of the bay into the corridor where 2 more of the colonel's personnel took custody. The colonel made a call on his secure radio that lasted 45 seconds and involved several words that Megan either didn't recognize or recognized from a context that suggested the conversation was above her clearance level. When he finished, his expression had the particular quality of someone who has been carrying weight for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. The transmission reached the Inspector General's office and Special Operations Command simultaneously, he told her. Both offices are treating it as active intelligence and have initiated the formal review process. He paused. Which means that in approximately the next 2 hours, a number of people are going to have a very uncomfortable experience. She thought about Vale. She thought about Holt. She thought about Harlan Voss and the unnamed man from the corridor and the shooter who'd just been walked out of this recovery bay. How many people are we talking about? She said. The drive contains documentation on 19 individuals. Some are civilian contractors, some are government officials, 4 are active military. He met her eyes. Vale is named as a domestic logistics asset. He provided cover for 11 shipments over 18 months. The hospital's medical supply chain was the mechanism. 11 shipments. She thought about the 4 wrongful termination suits she'd once heard mentioned in passing, the staff members who'd left Redwood Regional quietly over the years. She wondered how many of them had noticed something and been removed before they could ask the right questions. Holt? She said. He appears in two communications as a secondary contact. He likely didn't understand the full scope. He was used as a gatekeeper, told enough to cooperate, and not enough to be dangerous to the operation. The colonel's voice was neutral, not merciful, just accurate. That determination will be made by investigators. She nodded. She felt, somewhere beneath the operational focus of the last several hours, the beginning of something she didn't have a word for. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief exactly, but the specific resolution of a tension that had been building for 3 years. The tension of being in a room where things were wrong and knowing they were wrong and being told, consistently and patiently and with the particular confidence of institutional authority, that she was the problem. She was not the problem. She'd never been the problem. It took a gunshot in a surgical recovery bay and 11 months of embedded intelligence work and a man with classified evidence sewn into his body cavity for the record to reflect what she'd always known. But the record was going to reflect it now, and that was not nothing. She became aware that her legs were tired, not weak, just tired, in the bone-deep way that comes after hours of sustained focus, the metabolic bill for running on compressed attention and controlled fear. She found the wall with her back and leaned against it, and the colonel watched her do it without comment. "You should sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "You've been on your feet for—" He checked his watch. "Approximately 6.5 hours. You climbed a chain-link fence, placed a chest tube, assisted in a 2-hour surgery, navigated a gunman without a weapon, and lied convincingly to a trained operative." "When you list it like that," she said, "it does sound tiring." He almost smiled. The operative word was almost. She stayed against the wall, because moving to a chair felt like more effort than staying upright, and watched through the bay window as the corridor below gradually shifted from the tense, strategic occupation of the last several hours into something that looked more like the controlled aftermath of a resolved situation. Personnel moving with purpose instead of urgency, the specific communication style of people who are securing something rather than reacting to it. 20 minutes later, the first investigators arrived. They came in 2 vehicles and presented credentials to the colonel's personnel at the entrance without apparent friction, which told her the situation upstairs had already been communicated and accepted at the relevant level. There were 4 of them, 3 from the Inspector General's office and 1 from a department she didn't catch the name of. And they moved through the hospital with the quiet efficiency of people who were experienced at arriving after events rather than during them. The first person they took into formal custody was Harlan Voss. She saw it happen from the 3rd-floor window. Voss in the corridor below, flanked by an investigator on each side, his expression controlled but with something behind it that had curdled from confidence into the particular flatness of a man who has run his calculations and found the result unacceptable. He didn't argue. People like Voss rarely argued in the open when the balance had shifted. They saved arguments for rooms with lawyers. The second was the unnamed man from the 1st-floor corridor, the one who'd had the drive briefly and had tried to use classified authorization as a lever to keep it. Megan learned later that his name was Teague and that he'd been embedded in a mid-tier position within a defense logistics office for 6 years, and that the role had been designed specifically to provide deniable oversight of exactly the kind of operation the drive had documented. The third was Franklin Holt. She hadn't expected to feel anything specific about that, and she didn't, quite. She felt the truth of it, that Holt had spent years performing competence while actually performing allegiance to whoever made his professional life comfortable, and that this pattern had eventually drawn him into something he probably told himself was minor and contained and would never surface. She thought about the medication order, the dosage that would have stopped Wolf's respiratory drive and been recorded as a trauma complication. Holt had entered that order. Whatever his level of understanding of the larger operation, he'd entered that order, and that fact was now part of a federal record. The 4th arrest was Garrison Vale. She found out it had happened not from watching, but from the sound. Voices in the corridor below changing register. The particular quality of raised voices that comes when someone who is accustomed to authority encounters the moment that authority runs out. She went to the corridor and looked over the railing from the 3rd floor. Vale was in the lobby. 2 investigators flanking, one behind. He was in his director's coat, silver-haired, still holding himself with the posture of someone who expected rooms to defer to him, and he was talking. She couldn't hear the words from here, but the cadence was the cadence of a man presenting his credentials, invoking his position, expecting the presentation to change the outcome. The investigator to his left said something brief. Vale stopped talking. There was a moment, just a moment, 3 seconds maybe, where the posture held, where the silver-haired authority of Garrison Vale, director of Redwood Regional Medical Center, remained intact as a surface. And then something in it went. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a subsidence, the way a structure settles when the load-bearing element is removed, and the thing that had been Garrison Vale's confidence became something else, something smaller and considerably less composed, and he allowed himself to be walked toward the exit. From the 3rd floor, Megan watched him go. She felt very little. She'd expected to feel more, some version of vindication, sharp and hot. But what was actually there was quieter and colder and more durable, more like the end of something long and wearing than the arrival of something triumphant. Colonel Reeves appeared beside her at the railing. She hadn't heard him come up. "There it is," he said. "Yeah," she said. They stood there a moment, both looking at the lobby. "The IG's office is going to want a full statement from you," he said. "Everything from triage forward, the chest tube, the medication flag, what Vale said to you, what Voss said to you, what the patient said when he was briefly conscious." He paused. "It'll take a while. A full account might take several sessions." "I know how statements work," she said. "I know you do." He was quiet for a moment. "I also want you to know, for the record, and not for the record, that the actions you took tonight are the reason Wolf is alive, the reason the drive reached command, and the reason this network is going to be fully dismantled instead of quietly managed." He said it without ceremony, just as a statement of fact, which was the only way she could have received it without feeling like she was being given something she didn't need. "That is an accurate account of what happened. Someone would have figured it out eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but Wolf would have been dead by then." She didn't argue with that. Down in the lobby, the last of Vale's people were gone. The investigators were moving through the administrative wing, and the remaining hospital staff, the ones who'd been on shift for a night that had become something far beyond any reasonable expectation of a Tuesday in November, were drifting in small clusters near the nurses' stations, talking in the low, stunned register of people comparing versions of events. Megan thought about Roy Decker, who had pulled records and made calls from wherever he was, and had apparently done it thoroughly enough that the colonel knew his name. She needed to call him. Not with a SIM card and a storm drain, so that was going to require some logistical creativity, but she needed to call him. She also needed to eat something. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten, and she needed to go back to the recovery bay and check on Darian Wolf, because he was her patient, and the fact that the rest of the night had happened didn't change that. She pushed off the railing. "I'm going to check on Wolf," she said. "I'll have someone come with you." "I don't need Ms. Carter." His voice was patient. The man who came for him in the recovery bay was not the last person with a reason to want him dead. The network is documented, but documentation and custody are not the same thing, and there are 19 names on that drive, some of which are not yet in our hands. He met her eyes. "Until the IG has confirmed full custody of all relevant parties, you should not be moving around this building alone. That is not a commentary on your capability. It is a commentary on the situation." She looked at him. "Fine," she said. Morrison materialized at her shoulder with the specific promptness of someone who'd been waiting to be useful and was relieved to have a direction. They walked back to the recovery bay together, and she spent the next 20 minutes doing what she did best, which was looking at a patient and determining what he needed, adjusting his sedation parameters in consultation with Solano, who had come back to check on him and showed no surprise at finding Megan still in the building doing exactly what she would have been doing if none of the preceding hours had occurred. "How's the chest tube output?" Solano asked. "Minimal. Lung is clear." "BP?" 102/68. Better than I expected at this point post-op. Solano looked at the monitor, looked at Wolf, looked at Megan. "The investigators told me you're a combat medic." "Former." "How former?" 3 years. Solano was quiet for a moment. "I've been in general surgery for 14 years, she said. and I have never had a scrub assistant anticipate instrument needs the way you did tonight. Not a resident, not a fellow." She said it with the blunt honesty of someone who didn't give compliments easily and resented having to give them, which made it considerably more meaningful than a gracious version would have been. "That's all I wanted to say." She left without waiting for a response. Megan stood in the recovery bay with Morrison at the door and the monitors beeping steadily and Darian Wolf breathing in the careful, even rhythm of the deeply sedated, and she thought about the fact that the drive was at command and Vale was in custody and Wolf was going to live, and she waited to feel like the worst of the night was behind her. She mostly did. Mostly. The detail that bothered her, had been bothering her since the colonel said it in the corridor, was the number 19 names on the drive. She'd heard the number of people in custody so far: Voss, Teague, Vale, Holt, the shooter from the recovery bay, the 2 men from the corridor altercation, which was 7. Confirmed. Plus the unnamed personnel who'd come through the east entrance and been taken down by Karras's team, which brought it to approximately 10 or 11, depending on how you counted. 19 minus 11 was 8. 8 people whose names were on the drive and who were not yet in anyone's custody. She didn't know who those people were. She didn't know where they were. She didn't know whether any of them knew about tonight or had been in contact with the people who did and had therefore had the last several hours to make decisions about their own positions. She thought about this with the focused concern of someone who has dealt with incomplete situations before and knows what the incomplete part can do if you stop paying attention to it. She was still thinking about it when her phone, the cracked one, still without a SIM, usable only for the camera and offline functions, buzzed with a notification that shouldn't have been possible without cellular connectivity. She looked at it. The notification was from an application she didn't recognize, presenting as a system utility. The message was 4 words: "Check the supply corridor." She stared at it. There was no sender. There was no account attached to the notification. The application wasn't in her installed list when she went to look. It had appeared and sent the notification and was gone, which meant either her phone had been remotely accessed in the last 10 minutes or someone had done something to it while she was in surgery and she hadn't noticed. She showed it to Morrison. Morrison looked at it. He looked at the door. He got on his radio. The colonel was in the supply corridor 40 seconds after the call. He'd brought Karras and 2 other personnel, and they moved through the corridor with flashlights because the emergency lighting in the supply passage was dimmer than in the main halls. Megan stayed at the back because Morrison had physically interposed himself between her and the front of the group, and she decided not to fight it. The supply corridor was clear. No people, no visible threat, no obvious anomaly. Shelving units on both sides, medical supplies in labeled bins, the elevator at the far end with its call button glowing amber in the dim light. Karras swept the left side. The other 2 took the right. "Clear," one of them said. The colonel stood in the center of the corridor and looked at it with the expression of a man who trusts his instincts and whose instincts were telling him the message was not random. "What are we looking for?" Megan said. "I don't know." "Someone wanted us here." "Yes." "Either to isolate us from the recovery bay or to show us something." She looked at the shelving units. "If it's the second option, it's something that's been here. Something that was placed before tonight or during the confusion of the last few hours." "Or both," the colonel said. "Isolation and something to find. 2 uses for 1 instruction." Karras had stopped at a section of shelving near the middle of the corridor. "Colonel?" He moved to her. Megan followed. The shelving unit at this section had been recently disturbed, not dramatically, but the bin labels were slightly off alignment with their positions on the shelf bracket, the specific misalignment of someone who had moved things and replaced them without knowing the exact original positions. Karras was looking at the 3rd bin from the bottom, which was labeled IV Administration Sets, 60 drop. She pulled it out. Underneath the top layer of IV tubing packages was a sealed manila envelope. It had been there for a while. The slight compression of the packages on top suggested it had been placed at least several hours before, which put it potentially before tonight's events even began, or early in the evening during the period of confusion when the hospital had been compromised and the corridors had been less controlled than normal. The colonel took the envelope without touching the seal. He held it under Karis's flashlight. Written on the front, in handwriting that was extremely precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone trained to write in small spaces under difficult conditions, was a single line. For Colonel Reeves, eyes only. Not through current chain. The colonel looked at it for a long moment. That was placed by someone who knew you'd be here tonight, Megan said. Yes. Someone who also knew the current chain of command was compromised. Yes. Wolf, she said. He's been unconscious since before we arrived. He paused. But he may have had a contingency. 11 months in the field. You plan for the scenario where the extraction goes wrong and your handlers aren't who they're supposed to be. He turned the envelope over. He could have arranged this before he was shot. A dead drop with instructions to trigger the notification if his phone went offline for more than a set period. She thought about Wolf's face when he'd looked at her in the trauma bay. The rapid, precise assessment of threat and intent. The deliberate pressure of his hand. Don't let them. He'd been planning even while bleeding on an ER table. Open it, she said. I need a... Colonel? She kept her voice even. You said the current chain is compromised. You said there are 8 names on that drive still unaccounted for. That envelope was placed specifically to reach you through a channel that avoids the people who are compromised. She looked at him. What are you waiting for? He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. Printed, not handwritten, which meant it had been prepared in advance. The colonel read it, and Megan watched his face, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do in the last several hours of considerable pressure. It went pale. Not dramatically, just by a degree, a slight withdrawal of color from a face that had been composed through everything else. He lowered the paper. What is it? She said. He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, and she could see him making a decision about how much to say, and she could see him arrive at the answer. The 8 unaccounted names, he said. Wolf identified them in this document. He paused. One of them is the officer who authorized tonight's recovery operation. He paused again, longer this time. And one of them is the investigator currently leading the IG review downstairs. The corridor was very quiet. Megan heard the words, processed them, felt the implications settle into her understanding with the specific weight of information that changes the shape of everything that's come before it. The investigator leading the review. The man who is currently in the administrative wing with full access to the evidence, the witnesses, the custody chain, the communication logs, all of it. The man who had arrived with credentials and a process and the appearance of resolution, who was at this moment operating with unrestricted access to everything they'd spent the last several hours fighting to secure. She looked at the colonel. The drive data he's reviewing, she said, could be altered, or the chain of custody documentation could be compromised, or he could identify the other 7 names and warn them before arrests are made. The colonel was already on his radio, but she could see from his expression that he was running the problem she was running, which was that the radio channels available to him had just become uncertain. I need a secure line that isn't Roy Decker, she said. He stopped. He went outside the compromised channels when he contacted the IG's office. He might have gone to a second backup. She held out her cracked, SIM-less phone. I need a SIM card and about 30 seconds. The colonel looked at her. He looked at Morrison, who produced a burner phone from a jacket pocket with the resigned efficiency of someone who had been carrying it for exactly this kind of eventuality. She took it. She dialed Roy's number from memory because she had never needed to look up numbers she'd decided to keep. He picked up on the first ring. Carter, he said. I've been watching the transmission logs. Something is wrong with the lead investigator, she said. His name. A pause. Keyboard sounds. Then, Mercer. David Mercer. Is that name on the list? The pause this time was shorter. Yeah, Roy said, and his voice had gone very flat. Yeah, it is. How did you... He's in the building right now. He has access to everything. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, I have a secondary contact at the DOD Inspector General's office. Someone outside Mercer's reporting structure. I've been holding it in reserve. Use it, she said, Right now, everything you have. Already sending, Roy said. And then quietly, "You doing okay?" She looked at the colonel, who was reading the rest of Wolf's document under Karras's flashlight with the focus of a man who was extracting operational intelligence from every line. She looked at Morrison at her shoulder. She looked at the supply corridor around her. Fluorescent tubes in red emergency lighting, shelving units, the smell of cleaning solution, the faint persistent beep of the recovery bay monitors drifting through the wall. "I'll let you know," she said, and ended the call. She handed the burner back to Morrison. "We have 3 minutes before Mercer might act on something," she said to the colonel. "Maybe less if he's been monitoring radio traffic." "I know. We need to move." "I know that too." He folded Wolf's document carefully and put it inside his jacket. He looked at Karras. "We go in quiet. No radio, no advance warning. We isolate Mercer from the evidence chain and hold position until the secondary DOD contact can send a verified team." Karras nodded once. He looked at Megan. "You stay with Morrison." "I'm not. Ms. Carter." He said it with a patience that had worn thin but not through. "You have done more tonight than I will be able to formally acknowledge for some time. I am asking you to let us handle the next 15 minutes, because the next 15 minutes involve the part of this work that is not yours to carry." She looked at him. He wasn't wrong. She knew he wasn't wrong. But knowing something and accepting it were two different processes, and hers took longer than his. "If anything goes sideways," she said, "Morrison comes and gets me." "Agreed. And I want to be in the room when Mercer is formally taken into custody." The colonel looked at her with an expression that was impossible to read precisely, but contained, she thought, the particular quality of respect that passes between people who don't need to prove anything to each other anymore. "Agreed," he said again. They moved. The administrative wing was on the second floor, and they took the main stairwell because the service elevator was too slow. Morrison stayed a half step behind Megan, and she didn't comment on it. The red emergency lighting had been supplemented in the main corridors by the hospital's backup fluorescents, which ran at about 60% capacity and gave everything a slightly underexposed quality, like a photograph taken in the wrong light. The colonel went ahead with Karras and the other two personnel. Megan and Morrison followed far enough back to be out of sight. She heard, from around the corner of the administrative corridor, the colonel's voice, controlled and direct, without preamble. Then another voice, which she assumed was Mercer's, with the specific cadence of someone who was performing confusion. Then a change in the sound. Not a confrontation, but the compression of a moment when one person realizes that the approach they'd prepared for isn't the approach being used. Then quiet. Morrison looked at her. "Let's go," she said. They turned the corner. David Mercer was standing in the middle of the administrative corridor with his credentials case open in his left hand and his right hand visible and empty and raised to about shoulder height, and the colonel's personnel were positioned at angles that left him no useful direction, and his face had the expression of a man who has spent his career in a room where he controlled the information and has just arrived in a room where he doesn't. He looked at Megan when she came around the corner. She didn't know why he looked at her specifically. Maybe because she was the only one not in tactical gear, maybe because her presence in this corridor didn't fit the pattern he'd been expecting. His eyes moved over her scrubs, her face, the cracked phone in her hand, and she saw him understand something, though she couldn't be certain exactly what. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Interesting night," he said, and it came out flat and without the irony he might have intended, because the situation had taken the irony out of it. The colonel was on his radio, a different frequency than the one compromised by the operational chain, patching through to the secondary DOD contact Roy had reached minutes ago. She could hear it in his tone. Verification, transmission confirmation, the beginning of the procedural architecture that would formalize what had happened tonight into something courts could use. Mercer's credentials case stayed open in his hand. He hadn't closed it, and he hadn't lowered his arm, and she thought that in the small habitual gestures of people under pressure, there was always something honest. He was still holding the credentials because he'd spent his career behind them, and the habit hadn't caught up to the reality yet. She watched him put together the version of events he was looking at. The nurse who had started it all. The nurse who had placed the chest tube and flagged the medication and climbed the fence and gotten back inside and navigated the recovery bay, and been present in the supply corridor when the envelope was found. The nurse who had been dismissed and escorted out and who had come back anyway, not because she was heroic, but because she was in the habit of doing the necessary thing when the necessary thing was clearly necessary. Mercer looked at the colonel. He looked at the credentials case in his own hand, seemingly just noticing it was still open. He closed it. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," the colonel said. Morrison appeared at the corridor entrance behind Megan, and with him were two people she didn't recognize. New faces, different credentials, the verified team from the secondary DOD contact arriving through the secondary channel outside the compromised structure, clean. The colonel looked at Megan. Not a smile. She didn't think he was a man who smiled easily, and the night had not been the kind that invited it. But something in the look. She nodded. Mercer was walked to the far end of the corridor, and the corridor behind him began to change. The slow, careful transformation of a compromised space into a documented scene. Investigators working from outside the broken chain now, properly authorized, properly isolated from the people who'd spent 11 months trying to keep Darian Wolf's drive from reaching exactly this moment. Megan stood in the corridor and let herself lean against the wall again, because her legs had not gotten less tired in the interim, and looked at the ceiling with its underexposed backup fluorescence and thought about the fact that she was still in her scrubs and hadn't eaten since noon, and her car was still in the hospital parking lot, and she had no idea what time it was. She looked at her cracked phone. 4:47 a.m. She'd been in this building for almost 7 hours. She thought about Darian Wolf in the recovery bay. Stable, sedated, alive, when, by all of Vale's intentions, he should not have been. She thought about the drive, transmitted and received and formally in the possession of people who were not compromised, who were not Mercer, who were going to do with it what it had been designed to do. She thought about 19 names and 11 months of work, and a man who had trusted, in the last seconds of consciousness in an ER bay, that the nurse leaning over him was not going to let them. She had not let them. She pushed off the wall and was about to find somewhere to sit down when the colonel appeared beside her again. He had a look that she was beginning to understand meant he had something to say that he'd thought carefully about. "The secondary team lead confirms full custody of the evidence chain," he said. "They're initiating a secure review process independent of Mercer's access." He paused. "It will take approximately 72 hours to complete the formal investigation of all 19 individuals. Some are abroad. Some will require coordination with other agencies." She nodded. "During that period," he said, "I would like to request that you remain available for follow-up statements. The IG's office will have questions that only you can answer." "I know," she said. "I'd also like to request," he said, and there was something slightly different in his tone now, less operational, "that you consider the conversation we started earlier about your background, your training." He paused. "There are positions that would benefit from someone with your particular combination of skills and disposition. I can't make formal offers. That's not my lane. But I can make introductions." She looked at him. "I've been trying to be done with that world," she said. "I know," he said. "It came to you anyway." She thought about that. "I know," she said. He gave her the closest thing to a genuine look of understanding she'd seen from him all night, and then he moved back into the corridor to manage the next phase of the process, because there were still things to manage, and he was the person who managed them. Morrison was still at her shoulder. He had not complained once in the entire duration of the night, and she respected that. "I need to sit down somewhere," she said. "There's a break room at the end of the hall," he said. "I checked it. It's clear. Is there coffee?" "Technically," he said in a tone that suggested the technical definition was doing some work. "Good enough," she said, and they walked to the end of the corridor together, and behind them, the administrative wing of Redwood Regional Medical Center became the site of the most significant federal custody operation in the history of Ashford, Oregon, which was not a high bar, but was thoroughly and irrevocably being cleared. And in the recovery bay on the 3rd floor, in the dim, careful light of a post-surgical room, Darian Wolf's blood pressure held, and his chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of a man who was not finished, which was exactly what Megan Carter had decided 7 hours ago, standing over him in Bay 4 with the crash cart in her hands and Garrison Vale about to walk through the door. But that was the part she hadn't told the Colonel yet. The conversation at the very beginning, before the chest tube, before the medication flag, before all of it. The moment she'd looked at Darian Wolf's face and known, not from his vitals, but from something less quantifiable and more essential, that he was fighting with everything he had left. She hadn't told anyone that part. She sat down in the break room with a cup of coffee that was, as promised, only technically coffee, and realized that in the accounting of the night's events, the formal statements, the IG documentation, the recorded testimony, there was going to be one version of what had happened, clear and procedural and accurate as far as it went. And then there was the part that didn't fit in a statement, which was the 7 seconds in Bay 4 when she'd made her decision, not because of training or protocol or the calculus of institutional consequence, but because a man was dying and she was the person in the room who knew how to stop it. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Outside the break room window, the first gray edge of dawn was beginning to define itself at the horizon above the Oregon Hills, thin and cold and entirely indifferent to what had happened in the building below it. She drank the coffee. And from somewhere in the building, she couldn't tell which floor, whether it was a door or a radio or a voice, she heard a sound she didn't immediately identify, and then did. A single, sharp alert from a monitoring unit, not an alarm, just a patient waking up. She set down the cup. She put the cup down and went to find out. Morrison was already on his feet by the time she reached the break room door. He'd heard it too, or he'd been watching the remote feed on a tablet. She didn't know which, but he fell into step beside her without being asked, and they moved back down the corridor together, up the stairs and through the third-floor door. The recovery bay light was on, not the overhead emergency red button, the regular lights, warm and fluorescent and ordinary, which meant someone had gotten the main power restored while she'd been sitting with bad coffee watching the sunrise start. She pushed the bay door open. Darian Wolf was awake. Not fully. He was still tubed, still on supplemental oxygen, still wearing the particular exhaustion of a body that had been through surgery and blood loss, and more than a week of embedded operational stress before any of that. His eyes were open at about half-mast, and his focus was the unfocused focus of someone who is conscious but has not yet assembled a complete picture of their circumstances. Patrice was at the bedside, having come back on shift or possibly never having left. Megan had lost track of the staffing situation sometime around the second incursion, and she was doing the post-anesthesia neurocheck with the careful efficiency of someone who'd had a complicated night and was determined that the medical part of it, at least, was going to go correctly. "He came up about 4 minutes ago," Patrice said without turning. "Responsive to verbal, following commands. I was about to call you." "You knew where I was?" "Everyone in this building knows where you are," Patrice said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite dry humor, but was adjacent to it, the kind of observation that comes out when people have been through something together and haven't had time to process it yet. Megan came to the other side of the bed. Wolf's eyes found her. They moved with more intention than before. Not the half-aware tracking of someone coming out of sedation, but the deliberate focus of someone who recognized a face and was deciding what that recognition meant. She leaned slightly into his sightline so he didn't have to work for it. "You're at Redwood Regional," she said. "You came in last night. You're post-op to spleen repair, chest tube for a hemothorax. Both are resolved." She kept her voice unhurried. "The drive reached command. It transmitted successfully. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" His eyes held hers. He couldn't speak around the tube, so he did the only thing available to him, which was to move his right hand, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone working against sedation and surgical pain, and he extended it toward her. Not reaching for support, not the reflex motion of a patient looking for something to hold. He extended it the way people extend a hand when they mean something by it. She took it. His grip was weak but present. He held on for 3 seconds. Then his eyes closed again. Not the alarming closure of a deteriorating patient, just the heavy, earned closure of someone who had received the information they needed and could afford now to rest. and his hand went slack in hers, and the monitors continued their steady reporting of a body doing the slow work of repair. She set his hand down carefully on the bed rail. She stood there for a moment, and she was aware of Morrison in the doorway and Patrice at the other side of the bed, and the particular quality of the silence that settles around a room when the worst of something is genuinely over. She didn't feel like crying. She hadn't expected to. What she felt was more like the release of a breath she'd been holding since Bay 4, the very first moment of the night. The breath she'd taken when she'd decided, and then held, all the way through every subsequent decision. It came out now, slow and complete. And after it, she felt lighter than she had in a long time. Not fixed, not healed, just lighter. The next 72 hours were not easy, but they were navigable, which was the most she asked of things. The formal IG investigation proceeded through the secondary channel Roy had activated, supervised by officials who had no existing connection to Mercer or the compromised operational chain. The process was methodical and thorough, and from Megan's perspective, occasionally frustrating in the specific way that formal investigative processes are frustrating. Not because they were wrong, but because they moved at the pace of documentation rather than the pace of events, and events had spent the previous 12 hours moving very fast. She gave her first statement on Wednesday morning in a conference room on the second floor that had been cleared of administrative personnel and set up with recording equipment and 2 investigators whose names she was asked not to share outside the room. The statement took 4 hours. She was factual and specific, because those were the only qualities that served the purpose. She didn't editorialize about Vale or Holt or what they'd done or what she thought about it. She described what she'd observed, what she'd done, what had been said, in the order it had happened. The investigators asked good questions. She answered them. On Thursday, she gave a supplementary statement covering the supply corridor discovery and the sequence that had led to Mercer's identification. That one took 2 hours. Roy had sent his full documentation package to the secondary IG team the night before, and the investigators already had a substantial picture. Her statement filled in the physical sequence they couldn't get from communications records. On Friday afternoon, the formal announcement came. She heard about it first from Morrison, who had remained at the hospital in a capacity that was never officially explained to her, but that she understood to mean the colonel wanted someone present until the situation was fully closed. He appeared in the break room where she was writing up her clinical notes. She'd been told to continue her normal documentation, as though her employment status was not currently the subject of an institutional review. And he set his phone on the table in front of her with a news alert pulled up. She read it. The headline was not dramatic. Federal headlines rarely were, but the details accumulated into something that was, read carefully, exactly as thorough as the drive had promised. 19 individuals named in a federal indictment related to the illegal sale of classified defense procurement data to foreign buyers, operating through a network of institutional cover mechanisms, including medical supply logistics. Among those named, Garrison Vale, Director of Redwood Regional Medical Center, Franklin Holt, attending physician, David Mercer, IG investigator, Harlan Voss, unnamed agency contractor, and 15 others across military, government, and private contractor sectors. Charges included conspiracy, violations of the Espionage Act, obstruction, and in Vale and Holt's case, specific charges relating to the deliberate deprivation of medical care to a federal operative. That last part had been Roy's contribution. He'd flagged the medication order and the unlabeled IV bag in his documentation package, and the secondary IG team had added it to the indictment with the particular thoroughness of investigators who wanted the record to be complete. She set the phone down. Morrison was watching her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was the first time in 3 days that anyone had asked her that in a way that seemed to actually want an answer. She thought about it honestly. "Like something is over," she said, "and like I'm not entirely sure what comes next." "The colonel wanted me to tell you he's coming in person this afternoon," Morrison said. "He has something for you." She found out what it was at 3 o'clock, in the hospital's main conference room, which someone had arranged chairs in, and which contained, when she walked in, more people than she'd expected. Colonel Reeves was there in full dress uniform, which was different from the tactical bearing she'd associated with him through the night. Karras, Morrison, 2 officers she didn't recognize with rank insignia. She read without effort, and then did a quiet double-take about because they were senior in a way that meant this had been arranged at a level above Colonel Reeves's personal initiative. Several members of the hospital's administrative staff, not Vale's people, the remaining staff who had nothing to do with the conspiracy and had spent the last 3 days in the institutional equivalent of shock. Dr. Petra Solano, standing to one side with her arms crossed, and an expression of determined neutrality that Megan had already identified as her version of invested attention. Patrice, who had apparently been told to come and had come, and at the far end of the room, in a wheelchair because he was not yet cleared to stand for extended periods, with a drainage tube still in, and his left arm in a sling, and the specific pallor of someone who was healing from the inside out. Darian Wolfe. He was alert. His eyes found her when she came through the door with the same rapid precision they'd had in Bay 4, except now there was something else in them that hadn't been there then, or had been, but she hadn't been able to read it through the blood loss and the dimming consciousness. He nodded at her, small, definite. She nodded back. The formal part of the proceedings lasted 20 minutes. One of the senior officers, a general whose name she'd been given and immediately felt the weight of, read a summary of the events of Tuesday night as the investigation had documented them. He read it with the precise neutrality of someone reading into a record that would exist long after the room did. The summary was accurate. It gave credit specifically, by name, for each consequential action. Her name appeared several times. Each time she heard the room's attention shift slightly toward her in the way that rooms do. And each time she held the same expression, which was not modesty. She was past performing modesty about things she'd actually done, but the simple composed attention of someone listening to an account of events they were present for and verifying its accuracy. Then the general set down the summary sheet. He looked at her directly. "Ms. Carter," he said, "the actions you took on the night of November 12th represent an exceptional standard of conduct under conditions that would have caused most people, most trained people, to disengage and wait for someone else to act. You did not disengage. You did not wait." He paused. "What you did was see clearly what was happening, make the correct decision repeatedly under sustained pressure, and hold to those decisions when the institutional weight of this hospital was actively working against you." The room was quiet. "Special Operations Command is awarding you the Civilian Medal for Extraordinary Service," he said, "which is the highest civilian commendation this command can confer. It is awarded for exceptional courage and performance in direct support of special operations missions under combat or near-combat conditions." He said it without flourish, which was the right way to say it. The flourish would have been wrong, would have made it about the moment rather than the substance. Darian Wolfe moved his wheelchair forward from the end of the table. He had the medal in his good hand, his right hand, the one he'd extended to her in the recovery bay. He moved the chair until he was beside her, and he looked up at her with the steady focus that she was beginning to understand was simply his default way of looking at things that mattered to him. "You told me the drive reached command," he said. His voice was rough from the tube, still not at full capacity, and it came out lower than it probably usually was. "In the recovery bay, that was the first thing you said when I came up." "It was the information you needed," she said. "Yeah." He turned the medal in his hand. "I heard what happened after. Morrison briefed me." He paused. "You thought of the satellite relay thing yourself." "I needed something specific. It worked. It turned out to be true, which helped." He almost smiled. It was the right kind of almost. The kind that acknowledged something real without overstating it. "I also heard what happened in Bay 4. The medication order. The flag." He looked at her with a directness that was entirely without performance. "You did that before you knew who I was or what I was carrying, before any of the rest of it." "You were fighting to live," she said. "That was enough reason." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he pinned the medal. His hands weren't fully steady. Surgery and blood loss and healing did that, and the pin took 2 attempts to catch, and she did not help him with it because she understood instinctively that he needed to do it himself, that this was a thing he was doing with intention, and the slight difficulty of it was not an obstacle but part of the point. When it caught, he looked at it for a second, then looked at her face. "Thank you," he said. Quiet, direct, without any of the formal register of the preceding 20 minutes. just 2 words that meant what they said. "You're welcome," she said. Same register, same wait. The room held the moment for a beat, and then the general said something to the assembled personnel, and the formal part was over, and the room shifted into the lower register movement of people who have been in something consequential together and are finding their way back to ordinary human behavior. Solano appeared at her elbow. "The board met this morning," Solano said without preamble, because preamble was apparently not something Solano did. "In light of the vacancy in hospital administration," which is a diplomatic way of saying in light of the fact that the director and the senior attending have both been federally indicted. "They've been discussing the clinical leadership structure." Megan looked at her. "They want to offer you Director of Emergency Trauma Services," Solano said. "It's a new position. It would give you clinical oversight of the entire emergency department's trauma protocols, staff training, and case review. Full attending level authority within that scope." She paused. "It would also require completing your nurse practitioner certification, which given your background would be a formality, not a barrier." Megan was quiet for a moment. "You're recommending this?" she said. "I'm informing you of it," Solano said. "Whether I'm recommending it depends on whether you want it." "Do you think I should want it?" Solano looked at her with the expression she used when she thought a question was avoiding its own answer. "I think you spent 3 years being managed by people who were less capable than you, and I think that is a waste of a resource. And I think the emergency department of this hospital needs someone who will not make the same mistakes Vale and Holt made." She paused. "I also think you're going to say yes, because you didn't come back into this building on Tuesday night for any reason except that there was a patient inside it who needed something you could provide. That's not a person who walks away." Megan looked across the room. Wolf was talking to Morrison. Quietly, unhurriedly, the conversation of two people in the same world recalibrating a shared understanding of events. Patrice was near the window, coffee in hand, and caught Megan's eye and gave her a look that communicated several things that neither of them needed to say out loud. Colonel Reeves was with the senior officers, but he glanced over once, and the glance contained acknowledgement, and she received it. She looked at the metal on her scrub top. She thought about the choice she'd made at the scrub sink before surgery. The decision to stop pretending that her history was something she'd left behind rather than something she carried with her, that had always been with her, that was in her hands every time she put them on a patient. She'd spent 3 years making herself small enough to fit inside Redwood Regional's idea of what a nurse was supposed to be, and the smallness hadn't served anyone. Not the patients, not herself, not the hospital. The night had not made her something she hadn't been before. It had just made the record reflect what was already true. "Yes," she said. Solano nodded, once, with the brevity of someone who had expected the answer and was satisfied by its directness. "The board chair will contact you formally on Monday." She picked up her coffee. "The certification program starts in January. I'll write the recommendation letter." She walked away without waiting for a response because Solano was constitutionally incapable of waiting for responses to things she'd already determined. Megan stood in the middle of the room with the metal on her chest and the morning light coming through the conference room windows, and let herself, for the first time in a very long time, consider the future as something she was choosing rather than something she was surviving. It was not a perfect future. She was under no illusion about that. The investigation would take months. Her formal employment status at Redwood Regional would go through a review process before the new position was official. Wolf's recovery was going to be long, and the damage to his abdominal wall would have implications for his field career that she didn't know, and it wasn't her place to speculate about. Roy Decker was somewhere she didn't know, doing things he wouldn't tell her in detail. And that was fine. That was Roy. That was the particular friendship of people who had worked in difficult places and found their way to a version of ordinary life without losing the thread between them. The 8 remaining names on the drive, minus Mercer, who had been taken into custody on Wednesday, were being located through the formal channels, with assistance from agencies whose names weren't being shared publicly. That process would run on its own timeline, outside her involvement. She had statements to complete, clinical notes to finish, a certification program to enroll in, a department to learn how to lead. None of it was going to be easy. The hospital was going to take time to rebuild. The trust of its staff, the confidence of the community, the internal culture that had been allowed to calcify under veil into something that rewarded deference over competence and silence over integrity. Changing that wasn't a press release or a new org chart. It was going to be daily, and it was going to be hard, and there were going to be days when she questioned the decision. She knew all of this. She also knew something else, which was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that sat at the center of the night and of the 3 years before it, and of the life she'd built and dismantled and was building again in this conference room with bad lighting and a medal she'd earned the hard way. She knew that the instinct that had put her hands on that crash cart in Bay 4, before the drive, before the colonel, before any of it had a shape she could name, that instinct was not recklessness. It was not stubbornness. It was not the arrogance of someone who thought rules didn't apply to her. It was the knowledge, certain and specific, that the person in front of her was dying and she was the person in the room who knew how to stop it. That knowledge had always been there. It had been there in the field. It had been there in 3 years of being called just a nurse by people who needed her to be less than she was, so they could be more than they deserved. It had been there in the 30 seconds at the crash cart when she'd made her decision, and Garrison Vale had been a future problem, and Darian Wolfe had been the only present fact. Nobody had given her that knowledge. Nobody had taken it from her when they tried. It was hers, bought with training and time and the particular education that comes from being in rooms where the stakes are real and the margin for error is zero, and the only qualification that matters is whether you know what you're doing. She had always known what she was doing. The room was beginning to settle into the quiet motion of people getting ready to leave, the formal portion over, the morning moving forward. Wolfe caught her eye from across the room one more time, and the look he gave her was not gratitude exactly. Not anymore. It had moved past gratitude into something more like recognition, the acknowledgement between people who have been in the same fire and come out the other side still themselves. She thought, and this was the thing she would come back to years later, when the story got complicated in the way that all real things eventually do, that the hardest part of the whole night had not been the fence, or the medication flag, or the supply corridor, or any of the moments of active danger. The hardest part had been the first moment. The moment before action, when the system that was supposed to protect the patient was actively working against him, when every person with authority over her was telling her to stand down, when the easiest and most professionally rational thing to do was exactly what they were asking. She'd stood at that crash cart and she'd known 2 things simultaneously, that doing what she was about to do was going to cost her, and that not doing it was going to cost more. She'd chosen the version of the cost she could live with. That was all it had ever been. That was all it ever was, for people who did what she did. Not heroism in the cinematic sense, not the clean arc of the extraordinary moment. Just a choice, made under pressure, in the specific direction of what you know to be right, even when the room is telling you you're wrong. Especially then. The choice doesn't get easier. Nobody who tells you otherwise has made enough of them. What changes is your relationship to the cost, your understanding that the cost is real, and the choice is still worth making, every time, as many times as it takes. She knew that now in a way she hadn't been able to articulate before Tuesday night, though she'd been living by it for years without the words. She looked around the room one final time. Wolfe, Karas, Solano's retreating back, Patrice at the window, the colonel in conversation with the general, Morrison by the door, the ordinary November morning coming through the glass. Then she straightened, set her shoulders, not a performance, just a physical settling into what she'd decided, and walked out of the conference room to start what came next. The medal caught the light as she moved into the corridor, and she didn't look down at it. She didn't need to. She already knew it was there.